if we're going to tell that story, we may change it, but we've had a lot of this work done for us, right? We know what's at stake for them, that they wanted a child, and there's this tempting garden, and there's a great danger there, and so we immediately are anticipating how is this sorceress in the garden going to come into the life of this man and his wife, who we already feel some empathy with because of their wish for a child that they haven't been able to have. So this is a very spare beginning, as many folktale beginnings are, and it sets up all that stuff for us. It sets up what's at stake, the context, and it does it very quickly for us. So the issue of oops, that's the wrong. All right. I'm not expecting to see that slide. All right, well, all right, let's go here. So let's think about how we make a story, an experience, have a certain life as a story. And the first step is to start with something in the story. Now, in this case, I'm going to ask you here today to respond to a prompt. And the prompt is a time when you felt like your real self. And it may have been a time long ago or just recently, your time that you felt like your real self. That might have been a time when you were in nature, or maybe you were surrounded by people at work. It could have been a messy moment with your family. And take a moment to choose a moment like that, a moment you felt like your real self. And I suggest that if you have multiple ideas and you're worried about choosing one, don't worry, just choose the one that comes to your mind. In fact, choose one even if it doesn't seem like it's about this, even if it doesn't seem like a time you felt like your real self. And because we really just need an example now. But the other thing is that stories are about thinking in images. So if an image comes to you, if your mind presents you an image, then you want to practice responding to that. So choose that moment and then try to remember, well, where were you when that happened? And what, I swear, I'm just going to quickly see what's wrong, why I'm getting, I see what the problem is.
We can see very well your slide. Perhaps you can go just a little bit farther away from the screen so we can see more of you.
Okay. I can do that. And hang on, you know what I did? I'm not in the slideshow mode. I'm just gonna
yes, you are.
Because I'm seeing slides that we're actually not supposed to show.
Remember a time when. That is the slide we see.
I know, but hang on. Let's see what the problem is here. Am I in the wrong? No. Yes, I am. Aha. Mysteriously. I believe I have, in the process of this, opened the wrong file. Let's see if that's true. Yes. No wonder I'm seeing the wrong slides. Okay, now I'm a happier guy. All right. So I apologize for that. So let's see. So now I have to tell the program again to show that, and now I can show, let me see where I was. All right, this is actually where we're supposed to be right now. Where is this now? Where am I? There we go. All right, so thank you. I apologize for that. Let's get rid of this slide only, and then we're going to make these bigger, and then we're going to do this. Sorry, in the process of setting up,
Wonderful. Now we can see it very well and read it.
So, and now we're seeing the right slide. All right. So you saw a previous version of it before I had taken things out. So anyway, so here we are. The first problem we talked about is that that a personal experience was first an experience, not a story. The big solution is to grow the story and not try to construct it. So when you see something like the Grimm's Rapunzel beginning that I showed you, you think, well, this is terrific. I should start by writing something terrific like that. And the truth is that that's often the long way around, because the story lives between you and your listeners. And if you haven't given it that life, then you're very likely to emphasize the things that you wouldn't emphasize if you were really using it to communicate. So if you grow a story rather than trying to construct it, that can turn your experience into a story more rapidly and more effectively. The second, I think I now see that when I made some fixes today, I made them to the wrong thing. So we're getting a mix of my two versions. Anyway, so the way a story grows is often just from a little image. Like we'll come back to your image of of your time that you felt like your real self. But you come up with an image, and often you're able to place yourself in a particular place, a particular time. But then the question is, what happened before that, right? That matters here. And so when you're looking at that, you may find that the past is very shrouded in fog. You don't know kind of what became before you, or where you're headed in the story. What if that's the episode I'm talking about? Where is it going to be? Is that going to be the beginning or the end or the middle of a story? And we don't know. It's all shrouded in fog for us. And the way we discover that is by beginning to tell it to people. So after a time, you may find that the future starts to come into focus a little bit more. You realize, okay, here's where I'm headed. So now you've got a sense of we don't know all of it, but we got some of the sense of the future. We've got that episode that we came up with. What about the past? Well, then at some point, maybe in the process of telling about this to people, you realize, oh, this is really where it begins. This is what came first. It's not entirely clear yet, but it's getting clearer. And then is there some other piece of how you went from one place to another? Maybe that becomes clear as you tell all the pieces you do have. So when you're able to tell not just a performance, but the people who are listening for your sake, you can discover these in the process of trying to communicate. So in the end, you end up with a series of episodes or scenes that you can then begin to more consciously shape into a story. So now we're back to the time you felt like your real self. And now I ask you to remember where you were, who was there, what happened, what emotions were felt. And also think about what you saw. What were the visual impulses, sensations you had? Sounds? Did you have feeling on your skin? Feelings in your body? Did you have smells or tastes or any of the other many senses we have? We have way more than 5. Anything you can experience of the world or of your own body. Think about what you experienced at that moment. And in a minute, I'm going to ask one of you to volunteer to tell your episode. And before we do that, I want to talk about it. I mentioned a helping listener, the listener who's listening for your sake. And that's a particular sort of agreement. You know, when you agree to listen to me as part of a conversation, the agreement is that you can interrupt me any time, but we take turns. You know, and different cultures we can overlap or not, but there's an agreement about what the protocol is for conversation. When you're listening to a story, it's a different agreement, right? You agree for the story that you're generally listening for your own sake, but you don't interrupt. Well, this helping listener is another role of a listener, and it has these aspects. First of all, you're not listening for your own sake. I mean, you can have a good time, but you're listening for the sake of the speaker, for the teller, and you're listening with delight. In other words, you're not sitting there with your eyes squint and trying to figure out what's wrong with the story. You're just being delighted to listen and to be able to imagine what this person tells. And you don't ask questions sorry, I was trying to move that, but that didn't work. All right, what did I do? There. You don't ask questions for your own curiosity. You rather let the speaker control the agenda. If they ask you for feedback, then you give it to them. But short of that, you are just waiting their pleasure. So that's the role of the listener. Now there has to be a corresponding role of the teller, because you both people have to agree to the roles, right? So as a teller, when you're being helped as a teller, then you have to agree that this is going to be for you. Now that's not the way it mostly is. When you're telling a story in conversation, it's not for you, it's for the other person, and you have to entertain them, to communicate something, to make it worth their while. But when you're accepting the help of a helping listener, then you don't have that obligation to entertain. In fact, you can just sit there and bask in their attention as you think about what you want to say next. So those are the two roles for the listener and for the teller. And I'd like some volunteer who would be willing to tell just a couple minutes of your real self memory. So I'm going to pause the showing of the screen here so that I can hopefully see you guys. And so is there someone who would be willing to tell your memory of your real self?
I can share a very, very short story.
I think Svetlana is talking, but I can't hear you. Can other people hear Svetlana?
Can
you hear me now?
Can you hear Svetlana?
Yes, I can hear you, Svetlana.
Yes, you can. Okay, let me see if we can make it so I can hear her. Is there something? Or let me see if I can raise. Oh, wait. Okay. Say something again, Svetlana.
I want to share a very short story.
That's great.
Maybe just an episode where I was myself, and it is linked to the story that you used to open today's workshop. I was carried away by your story, and it reminded me of my time as a school child. I liked all teachers. I didn't try to be friends with them. I never tried that, but I liked them.
Right.
Now, I think it was because I had this age difference with my parents. My parents were 41 years older than I was. So I was more comfortable with older people. And when I went to school, I was more comfortable with teachers rather than with the students, with the pupils. So the way I liked my teachers was I listened to them very, very attentively. And I was also thinking about them as children, how they grew up, how they developed themselves as professionals. And this helped me to appreciate the work that teachers did every day coming to school and working with us. And I also focused on the subject itself. However, there was one subject which always stayed a mystery to me. I did not understand chemistry at all. And I didn't make an effort to understand it. But I liked the teacher, and I looked at her very attentively, and I got a good grade just for listening to her. That was my story.
That's lovely. That's great.
Any other volunteers?
No, I'm just going to take one, Svetlana. You're the one for today, just so we don't have a lot of time. And there's a couple of things I'd like to take us through with that. So I'm going to bring my my slides back here. So we had Svetlana was our volunteer. And so I want to ask you who are listening, I asked you to be the helping listener. What did you notice about what it was like to be the helping listener? So other people, what did you notice?
Are you asking me?
We had felt ourselves in her place as we were children.
Nice. Yes, other people. What did you notice as the listener? Was it easy to be the listener for her sake? Was it hard? What anything else you noticed?
I thought it was easy to be a listener because we shared an experience with Svetlana. And we may not have had the exact same experience, but there was enough of Svetlana there for us to feel with her.
I love it. Thank you. Anyone else? One more person? Something you noticed about your experience as the listener? I can't hear you, Brian.
I put myself in her shoes by following my own story when I went to school. And as an older teacher,
that's right,
that I listened to very intently. So,
I'm glad you said that, Brian, because it is a part of what stories do. They make us imagine the experience of the teller, but also we are making connections to our own experiences as we do that. So I want to ask now, Svetlana, what was it like for you to be the one who got listened to? What did you notice? What was easy about it, if anything? What was hard? Oh, I can't hear you, Svetlana.
I want to clarify the question. Is the question how I felt as a speaker?
Yes.
As a speaker, I wanted to echo, I wanted to echo, I wanted to mirror to some extent the story that started off today's workshop. And I also started off my story as a moment where I was myself.
Yes.
And that was the time of innocence. That was a time of childhood. And indeed, I was sitting on the first desk because I had not a very good vision, visual impairment. And, I really, really enjoyed my school because I was watching, not just listening, but I was also watching people doing their work, grown up children. I was not interested in the rest of the class. I was interested in them. And so for me, it was first time that I related this experience, and so I was in the story as well.
Nice. And was there any part of your experience, did you notice what it was like knowing that we were listening and we're trying to be delighted listeners?
Yes, I wish we had more webcams on so I could see more faces.
Exactly.
But it was quiet, and I also saw, just before I started, I saw that there were 26 attendees, and I saw their names, and that helped me as well.
I love that. Thank you. So I want to go on here. Did the story surprise you at all as you told it, Svetlana? Did it change in any way compared to what you imagined you were going to say? Oh, I lost you again, Svetlana. Svetlana, I can't hear you.
I think I failed to focus on my feelings, on the images, and instead of I think that was because I was listened to. I was thinking about people as well.
Yes, right, yeah. Well, thank you for that. Often things surprise us when we have a good listener. So so what we have here is we're still in the question of how to deal with the problem that our personal experiences began as experiences, not as stories. And so the big solution is to grow the story rather than trying to construct it. See, so Svetlana's next step here would include telling it to multiple times different helping listeners, and she would discover that it changed along the way. And then the second particular of that, the particular under that growing the story, is to imagine each scene in the story in multiple sensory modes. Now, I walked you through that in terms of who was there and where were you and so on and what was happening, as well as what did you see and hear. And we have at least 12 senses that we don't, 7 of which we don't talk about, but we have way more senses than we think. And so taking the time to just systematically say, well, were there any sensations of hunger or thirst? Were there any sensations of buzzing on my skin or feelings in my gut or in my bones or my muscles? Many times the answer will be no, but when the answer is yes, then suddenly you're imagining it more richly. So for today, those are going to be our solutions to that problem. Now, I want to go ahead and ask you, Svetlana, is it okay if we tell you some things we liked about your story?
Absolutely.
Great. So I want listeners, your job is to say something that you liked or that worked for you about one of 3 things. The teller, right, including how Svetlana told it. The second is the story itself. Or the third is the effect that the story had on you as a listener. So, and we want this. This is for Svetlana now. We're not doing this for ourselves. We're doing it for Svetlana so that she gets to know explicitly how we responded well. So say your name and then wait for Svetlana to call on you, because we want her to be in charge of the flow. If it's for her, she shouldn't be bombarded by us. She should be able to say, okay, I'm ready for the next one. So since we can't count on being able to see hands, just say your name and then wait for Svetlana to say, okay, go ahead. So who has something you'd like to say about the story that you liked? Svetlana, call somebody's name.
Yes, Michelle.
Thank you, Svetlana. So I like the expression in your face. You had this, and there's a difference between childish and childlike. You had this childlike, that's very positive. You had this childlike expression in your face, which made me feel like you were really in that moment when you were a child. A little smile you had looking back. So I really liked that.
Someone else? Something you liked about Svetlana's story, or the way she told it, or the effect on you?
Julie, would you like to say a few?
I liked a lot how I could imagine that you sit there in the first row and looked at the professor, and that because of that, he loved and gave you a good grade. I really enjoyed that part very much.
One more, please. Somebody else.
Thank you. Graham? Brian?
Lana's presentation is that the enthusiasm grew as she spoke. She was not sure where the story was going to go when she began, but she then grew into the story, and her enthusiasm grew with it and carried us along. And I particularly enjoyed that.
Nice. So I'm gonna stop there just for time, in terms of appreciations. But the thing to notice is that we're not, like, Svetlana didn't create a polished thing and then tell it to us. She told it to us raw and fresh and new. It was just not even hadn't been born yet, right? We were just getting the ultrasound in the womb, right, of this story, and that process actually helps the story grow. So let's see. Let me see if I can make this work. There we go. So Svetlana, while you were listening to our appreciations, did you have any new thoughts about your story?
Yes, I did.
Tell us. Can you tell us what thoughts you had?
I was thinking that I didn't end my story well because it sounded like I got this good grade in chemistry, not for my knowledge, but just because of looking at this teacher, which was true. I mean, I cannot deny it. But I also wanted to say that I was a good student. I was good in humanities, and I was good in this and that. And then I thought, no, that wouldn't be nice. That would be just boasting because it's not the story. The story was that I was listening to my teachers. I liked all of my teachers, and I was not interested in my schoolmates. I was interested in these grown-up people from the professional world who came to work to do their job, and that was what I was interested in. And I think I managed to tell it, but I wasn't sure about how good the story was.
Yeah, right. So it sounds, what I hear you saying, tell me if I'm wrong, is that in the course of hearing the appreciations, you were trying to evaluate, did I do what I meant to do? And you sort of thought, I should have, I didn't want to make it sound like, I cheated or something, right? I wanted to show that I really wasn't a good student, but then you realized at the same time that wasn't really the point of it. Is that correct?
No. Right, yes. But when I listened to the evaluations, I was thinking of the strengths that I have as a storyteller, because they were giving me this positive kind of feedback.
Yes.
And then I thought, after all, maybe, I didn't do that bad. And probably if I have those little things that impress the audience, this is something that I can use in real storytelling.
That's right. And this is a very important part of taking just a little memory or an image or some piece of a story and growing it into a real story. Is it Svetlana, if you'd asked her before, is this a story you're ready to tell? She would have said no, but I just asked her for a memory, right? And you might remember that she even made sure that was okay, right? She said, "No, this isn't a story. This is just something that happened," right? When we use this telling to helping listeners and appreciations, it helps us begin to learn what it is about our story that can connect to people. And we get to try it out without having it to be perfect, without having to guard against mistakes. And that allows us to learn a lot more very rapidly, especially in the beginning stages of the story. So I that's part of what the story growing process is for me. And it's worth noticing that the process helped Svetlana, but not by telling her what to do better. We often assume in our society that the only way to help someone is by telling them what to do better. And it's just worth noticing that this was an example counter to that. All right, so we have these stages of growing the story so far. Imagining, telling to a helping listener, and getting appreciations. Now, everybody got to do the first one, but Svetlana got to do second and third. I want to just mention briefly how powerful those three together are. One of my longtime students and now colleagues is a law professor at a prestigious law school. And her job includes supervising second-year law students in their first real trials. They're representing pro bono, no money, poor people, and the poor people are facing important things. They might be evicted. They might lose their house or their car. They might be sued for something, or they might be punished. And so these are very important. And these are students who've never done anything like it before. So Ruth noticed that by and large, the students did a good job of figuring out the law related to the case. But what they did not do well was the opening argument. And the opening argument in a law case is basically telling the story of your client's view of what happened. So you're telling your client's story of the case. And these people were very, very wooden. People would read them, and there was no feeling, and no one was moved by it. So she tried to get the school to offer a storytelling course, but they wouldn't. So she came up with this idea. She would tell our students. Let's say the student is Jeremy, and Jeremy had a case he was going to argue next Thursday. So Ruth would say to Jeremy, come to my office Monday afternoon, bring your opening argument, and plan to spend about 2.5 hours. And Jeremy was already afraid, so this didn't make it even that much more afraid, but it's like 2.5 hours? What? So the student, Jeremy, would come. He'd be clutching his little paper with his words on it he'd written out. And he'd sit down at Ruth's desk, and Ruth would say, okay, put the paper down. What? Face down. Now just tell me your opening argument. And Jeremy would predictably do a pretty terrible job. Right? There was not much communication going on. There was not much of a sense of what happened or why it happened. But then Ruth would say, she'd find some things to appreciate about it. She was a trained appreciator, and she could always find what there was to like, even in something that overwhelmed us with a sense of not being effective. Still, there were things to like, and she would say 2 or 3 of those. And then she'd say, okay, come with me. Leave the paper. And they go out in the hall, and Ruth would accost the first person she saw passing by, and say, maybe it was the custodian, right? So, and say, excuse me, Jeremy here is about to represent a poor person in court in a few days. Would you be willing to give us 5 minutes to hear his opening argument? Just listen and just say some things you liked about it at the end. And the custodian would agree, and then Jeremy would tell his story, and it wasn't much better, but the custodian would be a delighted listener and be happy to try to give some things the custodian liked. And then they'd cost somebody else, and someone else, and someone else. So Ruth said that by and large, let me notice that we're using these 3 things: imagining it, telling it to someone, getting appreciations, and doing it over and over again. So what she learned was that the first time was, never good, so-so at the best. But the 5th time was, by the way, at that time was starting to get pretty clear. And the people kept telling it to the 10th time, it was usually quite good. If it had been as good as that in the beginning, she wouldn't have felt the need to do this work with the students. And then, but if she held on for 15 times, it was always excellent. So this is what I call the Ruth method, and it just involves those 3 steps: repeating them with new, willing listeners, imagining, telling, getting appreciations, and doing it until the story gets good. We do not have this in our minds as a way that stories improve, but it worked well enough that it actually was able to bring a lot of poor people the justice that they deserved. So we have our first problem, and our second problem is, I kind of alluded to it, but there's no preset end or beginning to the personal story. Where does it start? Where does it stop? Again, with Rapunzel, we know where it starts. We can change it, but at least we have a place where we heard it starting. So how do you deal with that? And so I'm going to ask Svetlana, are you game for answering another question? Great. Say something aloud so I can hear if I can hear you.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So now that you've told your memory and you've been appreciated by it, what do you most love or value about that memory?
The fact that I was a child. It was my school. They were my teachers. And I'm so happy that I managed to communicate that episode. Because the episode itself went through my mind many times. from time to time,
Mm-hmm.
all these years. But I never told anybody about it.
Wow.
Today, I shared it very naturally.
Nice. And what's the thing you're most glad you got to share about that? If you could just had to choose one of the things that you're glad you shared, what would be the most important to you?
I think it was such a good tribute to my teachers.
Wow. Lovely. Uh-huh. And what was the part of what your teachers did that you were glad to highlight? What is it about your teachers that you were able to pay tribute to?
They were public speakers.
Oh, wow.
Because it was one of the best schools in the city. And, in the Soviet schools, classrooms were big. And sometimes they had a good control of the class, sometimes they didn't. Nevertheless, they delivered the subject, the topic. They worked hard, and they did their best every lesson. And I watched that. I was the witness of that.
Wow. Lovely. Okay, so that your answer to that question, right, is what I call the most important thing for that story for you at this point, or the MIT, most important thing. And so this is very important because this becomes your touchstone for the story, for organizing the story. This will be your the thing you return to again and again. Every decision you make about how to tell that story, what to include in it, and so on, will be that. Now, it can change over time, and that's fine. In fact, if you tell the story for different audiences, it will almost always change. Depending on who you tell, but any one audience in any one situation. By the way, parenthetically, that you can ask any other questions as in place of or in addition to the one that I did. Anything that evokes the main intention. And for some people, what you most love or value works. Others, sometimes you have to ask other questions to get the answer. So it's possible to have more than one important thing in your story, and I think Svetlana did have more than one. But the main thing is you don't advance a less important thing in a way that makes your most important thing less clear or less powerful. So you have to have one thing that follows through as the most important thing for you, and this is what makes your stories make sense to people. Now, the sense they make of it won't necessarily be the sense that you make of it. But if you do not have a single thing that follows through as the most important and is supported sufficiently and is never overwhelmed or distracted from by anything else, if you have that, people will find a meaning in your story. Again, it'll be their own version of the meaning. They won't necessarily find the same one, but they will find meaning. On the other hand, if you do not do this, if you are fuzzy about which is important and maybe this is more important, and so I really want this to be important too. If you don't have a clear leader in that, then you end up with the equivalent of the path of this ball. So I'm showing you a slide of a object of sort with a ball, and I want you to imagine the ball following the path it would follow if it just kept going around the object. And because this is a trick object, it's an impossible object, there's really no path it can take. And so the point of this is that if your story doesn't have a single path, isn't coherent, if you haven't made one MIT the premier thing of everything, then you'll have your listeners will have the experience that you have trying to make sense of that object. So Svetlana, what was it like for you to answer the MIT question? What was it like to answer the question I asked you?
The challenge was, did I manage to find the most important thing?
Yes. And did you feel that there was a progress between the time you started answering and the time you ended?
Yes, because when I said that the episode was actually a tribute to my teachers,
Yes.
it was what I, concluded when I was saying it, or seconds before I said it.
Yes.
I didn't think of the episode as a tribute to my teachers.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that the process of all the things we did, ending with that question, helped you know what you really wanted to communicate about the story. And so you discovered it in this process. That's why these steps are effective and efficient, because if you try to shape the story before you've had a chance to grow the meaning for yourself, then you will do things that don't work as effectively, and you will end up learning a version of the story that isn't working. Then you've got to start all over again. You have to not only find what really works, but then unlearn the other parts. So this is a much more efficient way to go. I'm just going to go on. So the preset end or beginning, once you shape your story based on your MIT, then the beginning and the end will start to emerge. So for Svetlana, if we had time, I'd coach her more about being where we distribute, what episodes would show the tribute part, and I'd have to ask her a lot more questions than we have time for. But suppose she said, well, the fact that the teacher kept my attention and responded to my attention showed how much the teacher cared about us connecting to her, right? Maybe something like that. And so then what episodes might be in the story in addition to what you described that would help the listener experience that. And so in the end, she will end up with a series of episodes that have a beginning, that is sort of where the story starts, maybe before she's been able to get to experience how good these teachers are, for example. She'll find her own way, her own choice of them, and ending with a place where maybe she understands, where she feels what the teacher's done for her by her being a good public speaker and perhaps responding to her response. So whatever it is, her MIT can lead her to be able to find where the story begins, where it ends, and what belongs in the middle. So our third problem is how to make the story meaningful. And as you can see, the MIT is going to be our tool there, but in particular, this part we haven't done yet, Svetlana hasn't done yet, of working to fulfill the MIT, to making sure that there's scenes in her story that allow her listeners to experience everything that's required by her MIT of making this a tribute to the teachers. Obviously, she's got to figure out what that tribute means exactly. And like I say, if it was longer, we could interview her about that and learn more. But so she has to, first of all, clarify her MIT more. But then, okay, what things have to be in there? What does she have to show? Does she have to show the same teacher working with a class that doesn't respond, or other teachers working with classes and not doing as well? So she may need some contrasting scenes in there. And once she's sure that she's got everything in there that we need to experience to get her MIT, then we have to also make sure that there's nothing that distracts from it, that anything that doesn't further that or is necessary for the things that do further it is omitted from the story. So that's how you make a personal story meaningful. And then finally, the question of the context that needs to be communicated. Now, in a way, when you start to tell a story, you will naturally put some attention there. And notice that in Svetlana's example, she, in order to explain her MIT, she had to bring us back to the fact that it was Soviet system, large classes, a lot of teachers who weren't able to communicate well. So that's part of the context that she will need to communicate in this story. And again, she wasn't clear about what the context would necessarily have to communicate until she's clear about the MIT. So you will naturally do some of this, but the clearer you are on your MIT, the clearer you'll be on what context you need to communicate. Ideally, you're able to communicate the context through the scenes. but that isn't always possible, or sometimes it's just too time-consuming. It actually makes things worse, dilutes things. So you remember in my story, I gave you the context. I first of all gave you the scene. Here I am, I'm late for work in the car in the rain. But then I gave you the context that I had been, all the things that happened before. I was a first-year teacher. Here's what my desire was. Here's how it went the first day. So those were all part of the context that needed to be communicated. Some of it I gave as much as I could through the scenes, but in this short story, it made sense for me to use summary and flashback to give some of that. And some of it I saved until it was needed. For example, I see the teachers there. They say the assistant principal's out sick, and then I explain what that means. Right? Only at that moment, when we care about it, we're puzzling. Like, why are they standing there? Right? Why are they greeting the late teacher? At that moment, the listeners are more likely to be interested in it. If I put that at the beginning, then like, why are you telling me this? So sometimes it makes sense to do things at the beginning. Sometimes it makes sense to do things just when they come up. But you will do the context by tweaking the scenes, how they're told, and sometimes even adding scenes that wouldn't be present otherwise, because we have to know by the context is, where were you, who was there, what were the rules there, what was at stake, what were the expectations? Because in order to interpret the story the way you want us to interpret it, we have to know those relevant parts of the context. So those are our 4 problems, and at least a sketch of how to solve them all for creating personal stories. So at this point, we've gone up to the point of what I call questions and comments, and I'd be delighted to take any questions or comments that you have and like to make. Again, say your name or raise your hand so I can know who to listen to. Yes, Julie, is that you? Yes.
Yes. I would like to ask you...
I can't hear you, Julie. You must be muted. Julie, I can't hear you.
At what time, if ever, we have to worry about having some problem or conflict or something like that to put into the story?
Right. Yes, good question. So you're talking about when you worry about the plot or the plot elements like conflict or something. Is that the question?
Yes.
So in my experience, you want those only to come out of the growing of the story. So when you have an MIT and you say, in Svetlana's case, what do I need to show to be able to have my listeners experience what a great job these teachers did? Then you get to say, okay, what it requires, what needs to be there. And at that point, you may realize, there's a conflict there that has to be there for them to get that. But the idea that every story has a conflict is, in my opinion, a great overstatement. Many stories have conflict, but I do not believe that it's required of every story to have a conflict. And I know many stories where there's not necessarily a conflict, or you can say there's a conflict, but you have to, you can see this as a conflict. And so the idea of looking for the conflict is only helpful when you realize there's a conflict. Okay, so for that conflict to make sense, what do I have to have in the story?
Thank you. Another question, someone else?
Yes, please, another question.
Misako?
Question or a comment? Anything you want to say? Yes. Misako, yes.
Thank you for a fantastic workshop today. I'm interested in to know the Ruth method. As you go through most giving speeches, the story is going to be more polished.
Yes.
How do you, if your target audience is different from the people you're giving speeches, how do I collect right?
Yes. A really good question. So again, I always, the backbone of my preparation is telling to listeners. Now, I have a lot of listeners, maybe 8 or 10, that listen to me at least once every 2 months, right? Many of them once every month. So in any one week, I have 3 or 4 listeners like that I schedule. I listen to them, they listen to me. And so these people are, first of all, they're pretty, over the years, they've gotten pretty skilled at this. And, and I'll say, here's what I'm going to tell to, here's the situation. And so they'll be able to imagine to some extent. But especially if it's a kind of listener that I'm not familiar with, then I try to find people who are like them a little later on in the process to be my helping listeners. Again, I enlist them to be my helper, not to be my critic, because what I want from them is how to make it work. Right? I want to experience it working with someone who has that point of view. So, for example, I went to Korea to teach business storytelling about a year ago. And so there's a lot of differences in Korean culture from the U.S. culture, from my part of the U.S. culture that I experienced. And so, first of all, I did a lot of talking to people who knew about Korean culture. Fortunately, I had someone who was very, very good at it, had a lot of experience, but I had other people as well. So I learned what I could about the culture from people who knew, and then at least one of them was able to hear the stories. But then the people who hired me, I got to say to the person who hired me, can you give me a couple people that would be willing to listen to me tell these stories, right? So I got to choose a couple people from the target group just to check that everything that I'd done so far was really going to work with them. Does that answer your question, Ms. Soto?
Yes, fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah. You're very welcome. How are we for time, Julie? Can I take more questions?
Yes, you can, as much as you would like.
Technically, we're at the end of the time.
If you can stay.
So no, 1 minute after the hour now.
So Julie, are we done, or help me know where we are?
Yes. So if you want, if you can have a few more minutes or even half an hour more, depending how much time you can give us.
Okay.
We learn a lot.
Thank you. Well, in case some people have to leave, I'm going to just quickly tell you a couple things and then come back and take more questions and comments. Okay?
Yeah.
So first of all, if you want to pursue this more, first of all, there's free newsletters at storytellingnewsletters.com. Sign up for those. You get a couple a month usually. I also have a free email course on the values of the future through storytelling, and that's free, and you get one every few days or every week. There's about 7 of them, I think, and you can get that at series.valuesofthefuture.com. And then third, it just happens that between now and April 28th, I have a sale on individual coaching, which I do Skype, in-person, phone, whatever. And so that's a big sale because I sell 3 hours of coaching, which are usually $195 US, so it's $585. You can get that for $249. So that's a good sale, and there's even if you buy more, you can get more of a sale. So that's a good time should you think you want coaching. And as a gift to you for being in this webinar, I'm giving you an extra $50 off. So instead of $249 US, it'd be $199 US. And there's a coupon code. We want to write this down. WITTY5, WITTY 50, WITTY 50, not WITTY 5, WITTY 50. So if you go to the sale.storytellingcoaching.com and you choose, there's 2 size bundles you can choose. It tells you more about it there. And then when you check out, it'll ask you for a code. And so instead of $249, it'll be $199. So those are just all ways that you can get more if you're interested. And then I'd like to do a closing circle. This will be the official end, but then I can stay on for another 25 minutes and answer questions if there are questions. But I'd love people who are still here, if you would, just to say your name and then one thing that you either liked or learned or found useful from today. So,
Michelle.
who will go first? Michelle, yes.
Yes, because I really love this, and in fact, I typed it in the comments. You're saying that you don't really need to find the conflict at the start when you're developing your story. If you have your most important point or thing, and then there's a conflict there, then go ahead. But don't force it. That is so important for me, because I actually always said, no, I can't tell good stories because I can't find the conflict, and it just bugged me down. And this was such a relief. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm going to make a little comment on that, which is that I just did a workshop for the first time a couple times last month, talking about that sometimes there are many stories that do not revolve around conflict and resolution, but revolve around connection and disconnection. And our society tends to be so focused on conflict and competition that it ignores the deeper human need for connection and how present that is in many stories. And I was inspired to that by Ursula Le Guin. You know the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin. She said something like this. She said, Romeo and Juliet is a story about the conflict between two families and between individuals in that family, in those families. But isn't there something else? Isn't there something else that makes it more than just a trivial feud story and makes it into a tragedy? And other people have suggested that it's a connection, and I agree with that. So this is a big thing, and I'm so glad to be able to help you from feeling like you were doing it wrong.
Thank you.
So I won't respond to everyone in such depth, but somebody, you just happened to say something that's really close to my heart. So somebody else, something you liked or learned or found useful from today.